If you've been paying attention for the last few years, I mean, you've pretty much realized that not only is software everywhere, but most importantly, at least to our community or our communities, open source is everywhere, right? Essentially, like we won. Like open source is how software is built. And if you've been paying even closer attention more recently, you've obviously noticed that as we've become more mainstream, and as open source has become part of and permeated all of the different parts of society, essentially, well, security vulnerabilities have increased substantially, and especially those that touched open source. And a lot of them have become very much newsworthy. And obviously, when that happens, we're no longer the one really paying attention to open source being everywhere and to software being everywhere. Legislators and politicians also are starting to pay attention. And there are a number of pretty important pieces of legislation, both in the EU and in the US, that are specifically targeting software and trying to handle and manage software security better, and also sort of like clarify software liability, so that when you buy a piece of equipment and the software makes that piece of equipment unusable or dangerous, someone is actually responsible for this. And so, what I really want to say here before I start actually talking about how problematic or how impactful, how maybe negatively impactful to some degree some of these different legislation projects are, I really want to say up front that I actually, believe that legislation in that space is super important. It is critical that companies who sell software-based goods, whether those are services or hardware, be responsible for making sure that those are safe to use and sustainable. And so, I'm happy that this is happening, and I think we should all be, because when there's good legislation, it helps us all. It's easier to do the right thing, right? It's easier to make the case to really release secure software or really release privacy aware software when there is a compliance and legal framework behind it to make sure that companies, your employers, actually do that. So I think that's great, right? The problem is if those laws are designed in ways that really negatively impact open source or open source maintainers. And currently, that's kind of part of the problem that we're seeing, at least mainly with the law in the EU, that is part of the Cyber Resilience Act that's being debated right now. It's not legislation yet. Before we get into like the details of the CRA and what as a community what the impact it has and what as a community we could do about it, it's also sort of like important to step back and to try and understand why we're here, close the gap between mismatched assumptions and misunderstandings about open source. So when you look at companies and when companies purchase software from a vendor to put maybe in a product that they're shipping or to bring into their own stack, they have procurement processes. And those procurement processes come with service level agreements, SLAs, from the vendors, right? You purchase software from a company or a SaaS, and that company, like the licensing terms, the contractual terms with that company, comes with a bunch of agreements like uptime and security and compliance to different things, right? And you used to pay for that. Now, when open source came about and really sort of started hitting mainstream in companies, the assumption from everyone was essentially that, well, why should this be different, right? Obviously, it's software. Someone's making it safe and secure somewhere, right? And, part of the story behind open source is less secure, which was, kind of FUD that we've heard like a while back, kind of is tied to this, right? This idea that, they're two completely different things. When you purchase software from someone, they're responsible for that software, right? Whereas when you're just like, picking a project up from a repository, you're the one that's responsible for it, right? Or at least that is like how the open source community understands it. And frankly, like literally how open source licenses have been designed from the get-go. The most commonly used and one of the oldest open source licenses is the MIT license. And I mean, I'm sure every one of you has used it at least once and has seen it like in a number of projects. And one of the perks of the MIT license is that it's really short enough that it's actually you can actually read it as a non-lawyer, and I'm not sure that everyone here actually has. And so what I want to do is just once read it out to you, and then we can sort of like see why it's meaningful in this conversation. And also sort of like figure out like where it comes, what's the origin of the MIT license and how that's kind of relevant. All right, so the MIT license says the following. After the copyright notice at the top was the name of the copyright owner or owners and the date. It says the following. Permission is hereby granted free of charge to any person obtaining a copy of the software and associated documentation files, the software, to deal in the software without restriction, including without limitation, the rights to use, copy, modify, merge, publish, distribute, sublicense, and or sell copies of the software, and to permit persons to whom the software is furnished to do so, subject to the following conditions. The above copyright notice and this permission notice shall be included in all copies or substantial portions of the software. So that's the first condition. And the second one is in all caps. And that's, to me, it almost feels like you have to shout out this section, which I'm not going to do. And if you actually talk about it to a lawyer, they will tell you that the reason it is in all caps is that it is a liability clause, and that liability clause have to stand out to have standing in court. And so it reads as follows. The software is provided as is, without warranty of any kind, express or implied, including but not limited to the warranties of merchantability, fitness for a particular purpose, and non-infringement. In no event shall the authors or copyright holders be liable for any claim, damages, or other liability, whether in an action of contract, tort, or otherwise, arising from, out of, or in connection with the software, or the use or other dealings in the software. Right? And that's it. That's the whole license, right? The first bit essentially tells you that you can use this software with the freedoms that we have learned to care about in open source and free software. The second part talks about the conditions, right? And then there are two paragraphs. One that essentially says, well, you have to keep the copyright notice and the permissions, the license itself, when you distribute the software. And then this big all caps paragraph that talks about the liability and makes it clear that the software is provided as is. You can use it, but the people who have written and contributed to it cannot be liable for it. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. You're providing this software for free, and you don't know how it's going to be used, right? So you want to make sure that while people can use it, they're responsible to see if it works for their use cases and to make sure that it meets whatever requirements that they have to meet from a legal perspective. And so if you go back to the origins of the MIT license, you have to go back to the early 1980s at MIT, where there was software that they wanted to release, and they wanted to release it with a license that would essentially allow everyone to use the software, because the idea was also to drive adoption of the TCP IP stack. And they were essentially, they really wanted that software to help drive some of the key standards of their times. And so if you look at the beginning of the license, it really essentially says, you can just use it. You cannot leverage the MIT brand if you're using it. And there was some back and forth with the lawyers at the time. And at one point, essentially, a lawyer said, well, it might be good to say that whatever happens, the software, you're given the software like this, and MIT won't be liable for it, right? And so, in the first licenses, you see a line along the lines of the software is provided as is without warranty. And over time, it became this sort of more, complete all caps part of the license. But really, the idea here is that liability belongs on whoever is using the software, clearly not the open source maintainer or the copyright owner that are providing the software freely. And there's another thing that I want to really outline here and make sure we have a good understanding of it, and I'm not, my comments are not misconstrued. I am not saying at all that that open source developers should not care about security or privacy or any of the things that matter to the quality of software. Quite the contrary, actually. I strongly believe that shifting security left is a good practice, and that we should have more of that. However, open source developers should not be liable for that security to be there, because that would create completely misaligned incentives. What we want is that organizations who leverage and use open source commercially be held responsible for the open source software and be incentivized as a result to contribute back to open source, whether by funding security, improving better security practices, or the vast variety of different things that you can do to help with open source. So the idea is, absolutely, you want to make open source. We all want to make open source more secure, and we want better practices around security, and we want to improve the security of the software that we all work on. But if we start making open source developers liable, it's going to be incredibly problematic, and it's going to really lead to bad outcomes. A quick thing that I actually do want to mention here, because it comes up quite often in those conversations, when I say that we don't want open source maintainers to be liable, I am not implying that someone who has criminal intent should not be held liable because they've used an open source license for their criminal intent, right? I mean, and that would never fly in court, right? You can't just essentially on purpose commit harm and then sort of like have your Joker card and say, well, but I committed harm using the MIT license or an open source license, and hence, I am not liable, right? You cannot sort of like, license your way out of being responsible for doing harm on purpose. All right, so now that I've given you this context, I think it's time for us to dig a little more into what EU and US legislation actually say, and how they can, that would impact you as a developer of open source software, but also users of open source. So let's start with EU legislation. So what the EU legislation does is it really tries to carve out an exception for liability for open source software. But it adds a caveat to it that is actually fairly important and kind of really ruins the whole thing. And essentially what it says is, if you're releasing open source software, you're not liable unless you have a commercial activity related to that open source software. And as anyone that's been involved with a Creative Commons knows, defining commercial is actually really not a trivial thing to do. People will disagree about what it means. What if you're a nonprofit? Is this a commercial activity or not? If you're making money out of like software-related things, being a nonprofit, will that fall in that category or not? Etc. If you're a company doing a for-profit company doing internal education, is this for-profit? Is this a commercial activity or not? So it makes it very hard to actually know when you fall under being commercial or not. But more importantly than that, it essentially says that if you have a commercial activity, then you're liable, and that commercial activity could be something that feels very adjacent. So, for example, if you've offered consulting services to a client and they have used a piece of open source software that you've provided, and maybe you have helped them as part of those consulting services implement that software properly within their own stack. So, for you to be liable for that implementation there to be done properly, that makes a ton of sense. And you probably have a contract within your client and yourself that actually says something along those lines. However, what the EU legislation would do in a case like this is it would make you liable for anyone using that open source software anywhere, regardless of whether or not they have a contract with you and have paid you to implement it securely and safely in their own stack. And that feels incredibly problematic, right? And it would be incredibly problematic. And it essentially makes a ton of the current practices that we have, that we're trying to set up to help with open source security and to help with sustainability of open source projects and to help have thriving and healthy communities around those projects, essentially backfire by making the maintainers liable, right? Imagine if you have an open collective for a project and that suddenly triggers liability for all of the maintainers on anyone using that software. That's highly problematic. So, obviously, the Open Source Initiative, Open Forum Europe, and a number of other organizations, the Linux Foundation, the Eclipse Foundation, etc., and companies are really trying to help EU legislators understand these concerns better and improve that legislation, right? But currently, it is very concerning, and the impact on open source could be really bad, and also the impact on Europe could be very bad. I mean, it's not. It would totally be possible to imagine that open source developers would decide to prevent access to open source software for EU-based companies, for example, in order to avoid liability issues. I'm going to spend less time on the U.S. law that's in the making right now, but just sort of mention the fact that it's also a pretty important law. It has the same kind of idea to essentially make software more secure and make sure that companies that are shipping software, whether in hardware or products or software or services, do so and are become liable for the kind of issues that would that their products would actually create. And so with the U.S. legislation, what's really interesting is that where the liability falls is in the right place, right? Essentially, the liability falls was the vendor making money out of leveraging open source, as frankly it should be. What's really interesting is that it includes a safe harbor concept, which is the idea that if you implement good practices as an organization, you are safe from liability. So essentially, if you can demonstrate that you have adopted good practices in how you build software, in how you leverage open source, and in how you vet the open source software that you use in your own stack, then you can be accepted in that safe harbor, and you can say, well, I have done everything that we believe as industry that are the right practices to avoid these problems, and so I am not, I'm protected from liability. So it's kind of really turning this into a compliance issue, which is, good because frankly, companies know how to handle compliance properly. So I briefly outlined what makes the U.S. law better, in my opinion. And, sort of the biggest benefit out of it for me is it really clarifies and outlines where liability falls, and that it falls on the folks using open source, not on those actually developing it. What I find really interesting is that clarifying the responsibility is really a driver for more contributions, and also a creator of business opportunities, for companies like Tidelift, for example, that essentially can step up and provide service level agreements, SLAs, for open source. So overall, I think that really clarifying this liability issue is great, and I think that that's a really good step in making safer open source software and safer software in general in the future. So while overall I am not as concerned with the U.S. legislation than I am with the EU legislation, there is another thing that I do want to point out that is problematic or potentially problematic in both. It is that they're both defining open source differently. Anyone that has heard me speak in the past or has read anything that I wrote anywhere knows that I strongly believe that reducing open source to just the Open Source Initiative's definition, the OSD, isn't good, right? Open source is much more than licenses. It is about open governance. It is about open practices. It is about the open source culture. It is about the open source community. And the open source community is like everything that makes us what we are and the software that we build what it is. However, we do need a baseline that everyone agrees on, because if we start defining what open source is in ways that are not compatible from one jurisdiction to another, it's going to be an absolute nightmare. We see this in the EU on a regular basis because the way EU legislation works is essentially in Brussels, there is kind of like a high-level conceptual framework that's designed, and then every country implements it kind of as they want, as long as it matches that conceptual framework. And there's a timeline during which they're able to implement it. And the end result is whenever there's like a conflict that crosses border, you start being in those incredibly complex questions as to, are you falling under the new law, the old law, the law that's been implemented in that country, but not yet in this other one? And it's a real mess. One of the huge benefits, huge value of open source licenses is they've made it frictionless, seamless to just pull in new software in your stack, because you don't have to do a licensing agreement on the one-on-one basis. You don't have to get like legal review. Every lawyer that works in tech is able to recognize the MIT, the Apache, the GPL, and the 7 or 8 key licenses, and knows what they mean and whether they're a good fit or a bad fit for whatever the organization is doing at that time. If we suddenly have different governments defining open source differently, it's going to make everything a lot more complicated. And we're going to lose, or we risk losing, this incredible value of the seamless adoption of open source software. In conclusion, with software now everywhere, it is absolutely essential that there is a legislation that actually protects consumers and end users of software. So having that legislation, I think, is super important, and I think it's a really important step to sort of reconcile the tech industry with the broader society. Secondly, clarifying the liability when it comes to issues with software between vendors of software and open source maintainers is also super important. And any legislation that moves forward in that direction, I think, should really be welcomed. It's, again, really important to say it. The liability belongs in the contractual relationship between software providers and their customers, not between the maintainers and anyone who is using that software. Finally, we should really agree on a shared definition of a baseline for what open source software is. And in my opinion, that baseline should be that at a minimum, any kind of software whose license meets the criteria of the open source definition, as maintained by the open source initiative, should be considered to be open source software. My call to action is for us to be really tight on our communication as communities and as open source practitioners around these issues, and make sure that liability stays with vendors and that we all agree on what open source software is. Thank you very much for your time.